Hi, everybody. Kathy Hansen here. Thanks so much for joining me today. I am super excited to be able to share with you all of my tips and techniques for creating exciting watercolor art. How I can create a lot of these really cool effects is by utilizing watercolor pencils totally by themselves or in conjunction with my watercolors because the cores of the watercolor pencil can create so many unique marks that the brush alone cannot communicate. So sit back, relax, and I hope you enjoy this little work. I've been painting watercolor for 30 years now, and what first made me think to try to start introducing watercolor pencils in my watercolor paintings was when I teach a lot of beginners, a lot of them have a hard time controlling the water or getting in tight areas or working with a liner brush loading enough pigment on it. And I thought, wow, if I could find a highly pigmented pencil that could get in tight areas, allow them to create all the marks so they wouldn't need a liner brush, could make the colors light to bold, it would be the answer to my prayers. Sadly, the majority of the watercolor pencils I worked with in the beginning were either student grade or didn't have enough pigment in them, or all the lines didn't dissolve, or if I was lucky enough to find one that had a lot of pigment, it tended to be like a gouache. And then I found the Kimberly watercolor pencils, and they were the answer to my prayer because they are a true semi transparent pigment, which allowed my white of the paper to still filter through because to me that's what gives life to a watercolor. And yet, I also could use them hand in hand with my watercolors, and I wouldn't have a transition line, which was also very important to me. So, we are going to be doing a lot with these Kimberly watercolor pencils today. So, let's get started. Most important thing you need to remember when you're working with your watercolor pencils is light touch. You do not want to hold it in the handwriting position unless you are creating lines. And then you have a lot of tight control. You want to back up on it and you want to have a light touch. If you want a light color, you just lay a little bit down, wet your brush, and come in and let the water activate those lines to create all this gorgeous color. For a medium value, you lay that light value down. Instead of pressing harder, you make a second pass over it. You don't want to press hard because watercolor paper with the cotton will indent very, very easily. And once you get an indent, you're going to create a ditch, and all that water is going to run to that low spot. So there's a medium value. And for a dark value, light value, another pass equals a medium value. Your dark will be created by doing that third pass. Wet your brush, take the majority of the water out, lay it down, and watch the magic. Look at all this gorgeous color and all the lines dissolve. Light, medium, dark value, all out of the same pencil. Now we can go one step further. Let's say we want two tones. Pretend this is a stem of a flower. Actually, we're going to even go one step further than that. I'm leaving a little of the white of the paper. I've made it a little darker in a few spots, so I'll get several values. Then on the edge, just come back and layer a little more pigment. I'm going to wet the lightest area first, then the medium value. Da, 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 da. Then I'm going to go into the dark. Look how gorgeous that is and how easy and controllable that was doing with the pencil, plus all in one step. If I were using my pan or tube, I'd have to put the light value in, let it dry, come back in, put another value in. And besides, like I said, being more controlled, look at how much quicker you can get several effects in one step. Another thing you can do is, let's lay green. That just was a darker green. You can layer other colors. I'm going to put blue-green on the edge of this one. Whenever I have two colors, I always wet the lighter color first because the darker color tends to want to take control. Da, 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 da. Look at all that gorgeous color. Did you notice that the entire time I wet that, I never lifted the brush off of it? And this is why. A watercolor brush is meant to release a little bit of water every time it touches the paper. And if I see people doing this as they're trying to blend, do you see this huge puddle of water they are creating? That's part of the reason that they do not have a lot of control when they're doing watercolor. If you lay it down and don't lift it until you have finished filling in the area you want, even color, even amount of water. So that's a fun little trick to share with your students. Another thing we can do, I layered here to create a dark and a light, but I actually can create new colors by laying one color on top of another color. I did green. Now I'm going to come back and put yellow over it. I could fill the whole thing in or just parts. That's a way I would get additional subtle hues within an area. Now this time it doesn't matter. I'm just going to lay the brush down over all of it and let that yellow merge with that green. And it created a totally different color than just the green by itself. Now, when you draw on dry paper, you get very distinct lines. You can leave them alone, or you can run the tip of your brush over it, and it's going to look slightly different, more painterly as opposed to dry pigment. If you wet the paper first, slightly dampen this right here, and then draw with it, the lines are going to be bolder and look wet. So this in itself, look, 3 different looks just with drawing with the pencil tip, whether you draw on the paper dry and then wet it, leave it alone, or actually draw on wet paper. Another cool thing you can do is you can draw lines. I'll just do 3. And then take a flat wash brush, and by going over these lines just a little bit, you will get subtle color, two-tone color all the way around it. If you get in and get out with doing that same thing with less water in the brush, these lines are going to be more distinct. Let's do that. Rinse my brush, make one swipe. See how they can be much more distinct with just a hint of another color around them. Okay, those are some of the ways that you can work just with pencil on dry paper. But what happens when you want to create something really soft and diffused? For instance, something like this. Obviously in watercolor, what gives you all these soft diffused areas is by applying the pigment on wet paper. So I thought, how can I do that? Yes, I can pull out my pan or tube colors because I can work these hand in hand with them. Or what's the difference between squeezing it out on a palette from a tube or taking a piece of 90-pound watercolor paper and creating a paper palette? I started doing this, and I've been working off the same piece of paper for almost a year. Some of these colors I haven't used at all yet, but as you can see, once I wet them and pull all that pigment up, there's no more paint to work with. So all you have to do is when it dries, turn around, take your pencil, draw some more color right on top of that, and you can use this palette over and over and over again. All right, so here's my paper palette. If you have water in your brush, pick up some of the pigment and put it on dry paper, it is going to be stationary. Oop, you can't even see what I did, so I'll move this over and do it again. On dry paper, the pigment is going to be very stationary. If I wet the paper first and then apply it to the paper, it's going to work just like regular watercolor. And look at that gorgeous color. I could do one color, I can do several colors. They're going to blend nicely together. It is your pan and tube watercolor. And you don't have the mess. You don't have the cleanup mess, cleaning all those dirty little mud puddles in the center of them. This is what I did for the longest time in a lot of my beginner classes, and also when I teach plein air. Just work solely with my watercolor pencils, with my paper palette when I want wet on wet. Another fun thing you can do is wet that paper, start thinking outside the box. An emery board or a sanding paddle works great. Emery board's not going to break the pigment as easily, so you got to work a little harder than if you have a sanding paddle. But sometimes, if you tend to be heavy-handed and you grate too much, it's better to have to work a little harder because less is more. So I'm going to wet the paper first, and then I am going to just pick up a pencil. I am going to lay the sanding paddle over it, and I'm going to put the pencil back and forth, so I'm in control of where the pigment goes. I'm going to run it back and forth, and look at all that cool grading. I'm going to pull this up a little more so you can see all that cool pigment. It only sticks where it is wet. So that is a really, really cool way to get extra texture. That was super wet. It'll even move around a little more for you to create some fun stuff. If my paper was drier, not dry, but not super wet, the particles are going to be much more stationary and not wick up as much. See the difference between the two? So again, how wet the paper is, how dry the paper is, the quality of the watercolor paper will make a huge difference in the look you're going to get from your watercolor pencils. I always try to introduce more than one approach in an area when I'm working in watercolor, because each look is a little different, so it is going to add more subtle interest. Another fun thing I want to show you, on my paper palette, just drew all these colors right next to each other. Now I have a damp brush, and what I'm going to do is just keep it stationary, keep running that brush right over that area to load it. And this will create a lot of cool, fun effects. Again, thinking outside the box. How can I create several different colors in an area, or make it fun and interesting? I could have gone back while this was still wet, maybe, and added some line work, even if I wanted to for additional interest or something. It is amazing what you can do with these things. Is your brain starting to tick? Are you starting to say, "Ooh, I could do this or this or this or this"? That I love options. The more options I have to do something, the more excited I get about working with something. Another cool thing with the watercolor pencils is once they dry, they're permanent. They aren't going to reactivate like traditional pan or tube. So let's say I wanted to come back in this area and make it a little darker. I could either do the palette technique or the draw and wet technique. Now, I have to sharpen my pencil. Perfect time to talk about sharpeners. Two things make a good sharpener: the angle of the blade and the type of blade. Look at, I barely twisted that, and this is totally sharpened, even amount of pigment all the way around. General's little all art sharpener uh, is all I use. I get a year out of one of these things instantly. It was created for soft core pencils. It has a very, very sharp stainless steel German blade in it. And again, it's angled to just expose this much of a pencil. A sharp point, is it necessary, especially in a soft core pencil, because it's more prone to break when that happens. All right, I digress. So let's say I wanted to come back in this area and make it darker. Look how easy and controlled this is. Okay. When I want the pigment to roll out to about here, I actually wet all the way down to there, because then I let the water do all the work for me. I wet all around it first. Now I'm going to run that brush over that pigment. And when it connects with the water does all the blending for me. Okay? All right. What am I going to do next? I gave you this little teaser, so I'm going to show you how to create this fun, interesting background. I always like to do this because large areas in a design are really hard to make interesting. I'm thrilled if I can get my beginners to actually get more than one value in there and leave a few dry white areas. But look how much more interesting this becomes just by adding a little pencil tip color on it. So what I did was, first I wet the paper. Try to leave some white areas because I don't have to pull out the masking fluid if I can do that. I've left some white areas for myself. Then I'm going to take my paper palette right here, spin it so you can see what I'm doing. First, I'm going to activate some green. Now I've got a lot of water in here because I want to make this a little light so you'll be able to see the special effects. Look at all that yummy wicking. Now I'm going to still had green in there. Now I can effortlessly create a light green, and I could take some of my green and blue and create even a darker green in a few areas. I like to get in and get out. I'll put a little up there too. Okay. So there is my field. Now, while it is still wet, I am going to grab my green watercolor pencil and my sanding paddle, and I'm going to grate in a few areas some rocks. Doesn't that in itself start to make this look a little more interesting? Yes, no, maybe so. Less is more, balance it out. I could leave that alone, but while it's still wet, I can further manipulate it. I'm going to take all the water out of my brush and pinch that belly so it kind of looks like a fan brush. And then I'm going to butterfly kisses, very light touch, start pulling some of those particles up. Isn't that cool? Do the same here. Try to pull them up different widths and lengths. Got to work fast because once it starts to dry, they're not going to want to pull up on you. There you go. If you push too hard, the pigment's not going to wick up like I just did there. What it will do is just smush it down. So it's real important to tell them light touch, butterfly kisses. I could leave that alone, or while it's still wet. Remember, when you draw on wet paper, the color's bolder. So let's take some of these even higher and different lengths. Look how instantly I created depth and interest. Same here. Tell them not to get carried away, because remember, if you draw on paper when it's dry, those same lines are going to be lighter, like this. So it would be another value right off the bat. And you could also take your brush, pick up some pigment, and actually create some drawn this way too. Do you see? Those are different values than this. And even your grass would have 3 values in it if you turned around and said, how many ways can I approach it? Let's make this interesting by approaching it more than one way. Now, when that were to dry, I could create my sky or the water or the ground. But here's a little tip and trick. All those broken pencil tips, because pencils break easily. Instead of throwing them away, I started saving them. This probably has about 10 broken tips in it. I'm going to reshake it up a little bit. Takes about a day or so for those tips to dissolve, but once they're dissolved, now look what I can do. I could effortlessly spray my whole sky in. Boom, right off the bat. How cool is that? While it's still wet, if it's darker than I want, I can lift some of it out or even make this in the shape of a cloud and create additional. What do you think, guys? Pretty cool, huh? You're in control. You could leave it alone, or you could even lift some of that pigment out while it's still wet and make clouds. A few other cool things you can do now that you know you can spray is utilize stencils and lace. This right here was just a paper doily that I laid down and we sprayed the background. Let me zoom this out for you guys so you can see it a little better. Refocus. There we go. How's that for a fun, cool effect? You can also use regular lace, cotton lace. It's going to be a much, much softer pattern that you're going to see. You can also take stencils. This was a stencil that I laid down and sprayed the design, taped off, and this was just sprayed. Let me bring this in for you. It was just a stencil with that spray. So think outside the box, guys. Think outside the box. If you've got the students doing journals, we just went outside and found leaves here, laid the leaves down, sprayed the background when it dried. That was a really cool background for a stencil. All right, guys, I am going to stop for a second. I'll be right back. I'm going to get a bunch of new cool supplies out here to show you some really cool texture techniques. And she's back again. Okay, first special effect technique I want to show you is with one of the many items that I found around the house. I love just picking up stuff and saying, could I utilize this? What kind of mark would it make? And you know, we all have tight budgets anymore, so the more inexpensive household items you can find for your art, the better. First thing we're gonna do, good old-fashioned plastic wrap. I know some of you know how to create fractured lines, but never fails. There's always somebody that hasn't seen it, so I always like to include it. You're going to pre-wet the paper. Now, you could do draw and wet or palette technique, but I'm going to do palette technique just because it's quicker. So I'm going to just grab a few colors. By now you should know when I say palette, I'm activating color, and I'm just dropping it in, seeing where it's going to go, what it wants to do. Throw a few more colors in real quick. I am going to pretty well let the water do all the mixing for me here. And then while it's wet, you loosely lay down the plastic wrap and let it start connecting with it and see what kind of patterns it is going to make on its own as it starts suctioning. See how I'm kind of pushing it a little bit? It's making all these really cool marks. You can alter them if you don't like them until you find a design that you like, and then you actually would just leave this until it totally dried and then lift it off. If you let it totally dry, the line's going to be very distinct. If you would like them a little looser, then right before it's dry, 3/4 of the way dry, you can lift this off, and then you have removed all these little walls that keeps the paint from going in these areas, so it'll back slightly out and it'll make your lines a little looser. While that's drying, I want to show you a few fun examples. Can't afford mats in the classroom? Look how easy it is to make a mat out of just a piece of 90-pound watercolor paper, mixed media paper, illustration paper, anything that can handle moisture. This is a fun little one. You just want to make a card or something, or a fun background, and then do art on top of it. Here's another example of those fractured lines. For the younger kids, makes a great, interesting background just with a small geometric background and a flower with pen and ink. But it's really, really great when you're doing landscapes because look how that instantly created a foreground and a background. And it actually gave it depth, and it makes you want to walk through that forest and see what's around the corner. This I did super easy. This was paper towel that I jaggedly laid down. This was different widths of masking tape or painter's tape I laid down. Then we wet it and we did it. Boom. This was such a great springboard for these kids because they instantly had a visual they could build upon. This is a whole different look with it. Kind of made it kind of whimsical when as we started building up some foreground elements around it. This leaf. Leaves are probably one of the hardest things to do. Look how interesting that leaf is before you even add any details to it, just by having those soft, subtle fractured lines, and then as you build upon it. This is what I mean about a lot of subtle play going on in the background of a painting. It's not screaming at you, but it pulls you in. You don't know why you're so interested. Well, it's all these unexpected passages that just kind of grab the attention. Now, this should have dried a little. Okay, now you will see then that those lines are going to even back off more. Another thing you can do with plastic wrap, let's say we are doing a tree trunk, is sometimes aspens. There's a lot of trees that don't have dark bark on them or real interesting bark. So what you can do is make a nice little soupy puddle here of a few colors and just crinkle this stuff up. Make a pattern with it. Little things like this. Now, this could be your first layer, and when that dries, we'll come back and throw some color over it. That in itself gave a little bit of interest to an otherwise boring tree trunk. The next thing I want to show you, speaking of tree trunks, take a room key. You wouldn't want to take a credit card, but well, then again, you might. We're going to make another soupy puddle here. And you're just going to load it. You're just going to get some paint on it, okay? And then lay it down and kind of drag it. Another way to make interesting areas within a tree trunk. Again, something to build upon. Maybe once that dried, and actually that is pretty dry. Remember, I can go in just a few areas even if I want with that grading. That'll make this super interesting. Because remember, it only sticks where it finds moisture. So do you see how we could build off of this? There are so many different ways to add subtle, unexpected areas of interest within something. We could have come back and drawn with that pencil, really let it sit in that wet area for bold darks. You're starting to, is your mind going? Like I said, there are so many different ways. I could have come back in with color on my brush and softly added additional color over it. See, it doesn't reactivate. That's the beauty of this. So it's so easy to glaze additional colors too. Again, we're building off of the previous texture or step. I'm trying to put a lot in a short amount of time, guys, okay? What is something else from the house. Good old-fashioned toothbrush. We've all done that. I'm going to load it up with some paint off of my palette. Gee, we could have even put some of that on it too. Another cool thing, if you're looking for different size dots in something, you can take different size dowel rods. The thicker the diameter, the bigger the dots are going to be. But you see, what I like about doing this is they're all different shapes and sizes, which again is much more interesting than just dot, 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 the same amount. Another cool texture thing, we've all done salt and watercolor, but let me show you two other things. Obviously, I am pre-wetting my paper. So I am going to put some paint in here in a few spots. The wetter the paper, the more the salt is going to absorb. The drier the paper, the less. So we're going to put salt in this area. Excuse me. But now we're going to take rubbing alcohol. There are 70 and 91%. Rubbing alcohol is going to react differently on the paper. Right now I am looking for an inexpensive brush. I don't like to use my expensive brushes. So what rubbing alcohol does different is the salt absorbs it. The rubbing alcohol pushes the pigment away. See what happens? See how it pushes it away and makes a hard line of color on the outside. Couldn't you see doing something like that within a design? Let me do this up close and show you again. And the more alcohol on the brush, the more it's going to push away. Get this up close again. And make a hard line of color. Can you see that? Total different look than the salt. The third thing you can do, believe it or not, is stick your hand in some water. Get the majority of it off your hand, so you just have a little left, and flick it. It is going to give a much more subtle version with less rigid lines on the outside than the salt will. So boom, salt, rubbing alcohol, and water. 3 more really cool special effect techniques that you can utilize in your watercolor pencil paintings. The next thing I want to show you is something called press and seal. Aren't these mountains just amazing? Look up close. Can you see all those little pockmarks, those porous areas? It just looks like Mother Nature just through years and time has just worn away at the rock. That is done with press and seal. Now, again, you can do drawn wet, put the colors in that way prior to do it, or you could do a palette technique. And I'm going to show you both for this. Drawn wet color is always going to be bolder than palette technique because you are diluting it, the value of the color with water every time, whereas when you draw on wet, it is more concentrated color. So what I'm going to do is make the shape of my mountains. There's something on this paper. Interesting. It's almost resisting the water. But because I'm so curious, I am going to continue to try to work on this and see what it's going to do. We might have to start over, but let's experiment, right? All right. Another thing that made this so cool is look at some of the colors. I used colors people weren't expecting. I used a little turquoise, sea green, olive green. Lots of times we think mountains, oh, we got to use all earth tones. So think outside the box sometimes with your color choices. It can make a world of difference in the finished design. Okay, I'm just sort of freehanding. Ooh, I haven't used turquoise before. We'll use a little turquoise. Then we'll get some brown in here, some earth tones. You got to move fast because you are going to want the paper nice and wet, so you're going to get the most texture. That comes from it being super, super wet. Okay? And this time you do not squish it. This time you lay it flat and let it make contact with the paper. And that is how you're going to get all those little pock marks. And hopefully that's going to show up when I lift it. Isn't that cool? I'll go ahead and wet part of these to show you what I would have done if I did the drawn wet. The secret is several colors. Remember I said earlier, wet the lighter areas first. Now I'm just going to let the water end up doing the mixing. So I'm making sure I got a lot of water here. You can't go wrong. And now watch, if I get in and out and do not dissolve all of the pigment particles, I will have two types of texture in it this time. I'll try to lift that up before I put that on. See, I already have a little bit of texture showing because I did not totally dissolve all the lines to make a smooth pigment like I did right in there. So that's how it would have looked if I would have drawn in wet and then put it on top of it. I have another piece of that somewhere. Gosh darn it, here it is. Because I also wanted to show you, man, oh man, it makes awesome flower centers too. Real fast, I'm just going to draw some in, a few colors. Again, think outside the box. I did mountains, but what else would it look really, really cool on? So here I'm going to activate my pigment. See how quickly I can establish more than one color. And sometimes when time is of the essence, it's worth its weight in gold. Right off the bat, before we even got additional colors. Look how interesting that sunflower center would look. Another cool thing you can use, bubble wrap. Seriously, I want you all to, when this is over, walk around your house and you are going to be amazed at what you see right in front of your eyes that you never thought of before just by looking at it a little differently. And I always love to encourage experimentation. You know, the worst thing that's going to happen is you aren't going to like it, but you might not like one thing to five things. You're like, oh my God, this is so cool. I wish I would have tried this sooner. So we can even do a little stamping effect here with it. See what I'm saying? Ooh, I just love all this stuff. Resist. Let's talk resist. Many times I do not have time to pull out masking fluid. So as I said earlier, I like to do a water resist. Remember, paint is only going to go where it finds moisture. It is not, it's just not going to go other places. So you can do a water resist. Excuse me. You can also take a wax crayon. This was left over from an Easter egg kit, or this is a white crayon from Crayola. The white crayon actually is going to look whiter than the wax crayon. I'll do this in a different shape because the wax one is going to allow whatever color your paper is to show through, where the crayon's going to totally block it. So first we'll wet those, show you what they look like. Again, I'm doing all this with my palette color. So there's the crayon, and there's that wax stick. I will do this if I have no intention of going back in that area and adding more color. All my intention is to preserve the white of the paper. You can do either one of these easily. I've also used a glue stick It gives a really cool textured look. Sometimes I've even used Elmer's glue in advance where you could dry it really cool for abstracts or mixed medias. And then the last thing that I use for a resist is wax paper. Again, when the goal is just to preserve the white of the paper, what I'm going to do is I lay it down. I have a chisel edge on the end of my brush, but you could take a stylus, almost anything, and basically I have now transferred that wax onto my paper, so I have another type of a recess we can do. Ta-da! These are, I hope you think these are as cool as I do. Obviously, there's sponges too you could use. I utilize all different kinds of tapes at time or papers when I am just trying to preserve the white area of something. Another cool thing that you can do to get textures is utilize cheesecloth because you can make a lot of cool effects with it. You can just lay it down and spray. This one, what I did is besides spraying it, I actually took my brush loaded with color and really, really souped it up so you could get all of these kind of soft effects. And one more thing you can do, you can leave that particular shape within the strings, or you can change the string pattern. This is really cool. Oh, that started to a little bit. Let's see. Can you see? Look at all those cool marks. Let's see if this one too. Yes, yes, yes. There you go. I hope you utilize a few of these techniques. Okay, here we go. Sometimes it's really cool. You can almost create the look of waves just by the way you change the pattern of the string. And when I do that, I utilize my tips that were dissolved in a bottle. Let's see if we got what we wanted. Yep. Well, guys, since today's workshop was literally from my house to yours, I thought the last watercolor pencil piece of art I'd share with you is where I live. This is my bay in the northern woods of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. I sure hope you guys enjoyed today, had a good time, and hopefully learned something new. If you're interested in seeing additional videos, please visit www.generalpencil.com. They have so many wonderful videos in their library, artists in action, as well as a lot of cool visits to the factory, which are really worth watching. Also, please visit my website, www.kathyhansen.com, where I'm going to be putting a lot of cool little instructional tutorials and videos as well. Also, my Facebook page, Kathy's Creative Studio. Hope you visit that as well. And last but not least, General Pencil is now offering all kinds of virtual professional development workshops free of charge. Also come with lots of goodies, and I've got a whole variety of workshops that you can choose from, as well as we now have a portrait artist. You might be interested in one of hers too. So for questions for that, contact General Pencil, or feel free to leave a note on my website as well, and we'll send you additional details. So I hope you enjoy the rest of your conference. Take care and hope to see you soon. Bye.